Hello, hello. Welcome to a new chapter. Today we're going to be discussing chapter 13, which will give us a quick overview of the spinal cord, the spinal nerves, and the somatic reflexes. All right, so thus far we've had a couple of chapters where we looked at the nervous system and we kind of explored the brain, the spinal cord. We talked about things like the neuromuscular junction. In our previous chapter, we took a more detailed look at the neurons and the glial cells and how they all cooperate and work together with our sensory system as well as with our motor system, in essence, for the body to interpret signals both internally and externally, and then of course respond accordingly. So what we'll do in chapter 13 is we're going to go ahead and take just an overview, just like a nicer look at the spinal cord. Let's take a look at where exactly you can find it. Is it the entire length of your back? Let's talk about the different nerves that radiate out of it. And of course, along the way, we'll also take a look at the overall anatomy, as in the shape that goes into the spinal cord, as well as what it means when you talk about white matter versus gray matter when it comes to the nervous system. And a hint for that, remember your myelination. All right, so let's just start with the beginning. What are some functions of the spinal cord? By now, we should be comfortable with the fact that the spinal cord is an extension of the brain. And remember, you had your occipital condyle by your occipital bone in the back of the skull that allows for the nice opening so that the spinal cord can go ahead and go in between the vertebra. So you have the bone casings that will go ahead and protect this delicate tissue as it travels down your back. And it turns out that within the spinal cord, we're going to have four main functions. The first one is going to be entitled conduction. And conduction basically means that it's going to allow for both your sensory and motor neurons to allow for communication as it's traveling up and down and connecting with the interneurons that you're used to when you take a look at your brain. So conduction is the first one. The second one is neural integration. And neural integration is going to focus on the fact that these neurons that you have in the spine, they are able to, in essence, receive input from multiple sources, meaning it doesn't matter if it's from like a visceral source or more of a somatic source, which part of the sensory system is signaling the senses. These spinal neurons are able to receive the input. They're able to integrate it, meaning that they're able to communicate with the brain and figure out what needs to get done. And once the interneurons in the brain have figured out a plan of action, they will go ahead and travel it down, send it down its way so that the appropriate output can be conducted regardless of what part of the body you could be looking for. So on the slide, we talk about, for instance, bladder control. You might have the sensation that you have to urinate, but maybe you're in the middle of class or you're in the middle of an important call. You can't really leave right now, so the nervous system will detect the need and it will go ahead and send a signal to hold onto the sphincter so that you can hold your bladder, and hopefully you'll be done with whatever you're doing quickly so you can go ahead and relieve yourself. But it can also be something as simplistic as muscle contraction and relaxation, which is what we came across in our chapter 11 when we were taking a look at the neuromuscular junction. The third function of the spinal cord, and this is a very interesting one, it's locomotion. So it turns out that within the spinal cord, there will be a group of neurons that are going to be called what we call CPGs, Central Pattern Generators. And they get their names because when these neurons are activated, they will always respond the same by producing what they call a repetitive sequence. So their course of action is always the same, and they will just have this repeating, like onward and offward response to what they're doing. A really good example of a central pattern generator is walking. So when the neurons in the spinal cord get the signal that it's time for you to get up and start walking, when these neurons are activated, they are the ones that are responsible for us lifting our foot, taking a step, putting it down, switching over to the next foot, lifting it up, taking a step, and putting it down. And this pattern of making gaits or making movements, so one foot in front of the next, in front of the next, in front of the next, this is an example of a central pattern generator. Another example would be, for instance, if you've ever taken a look at the swimming motion of different animals, like for instance a fish. When you see that the fish is activated with swimming, you'll see how the tail and the fins will move in a very uniform pattern as they glide through the water. And that movement, that continuous backwards and forward movement, that's all due to the fact of a group of neurons that are entitled central pattern generators. So whenever they're activated, they will always have this repetitive stimuli that they set off. And then the fourth function of the spinal cord is going to be our reflexes. Reflexes are involuntary responses, meaning that your body will always respond the same exact way as long as the stimuli is received for it. What's really cool about reflexes is usually they happen very quickly and you have no control over it, and the main purpose is to control your posture, your coordination, and oftentimes to protect the body. Probably the best example of a reflex that we can all name is if I put my hand on something hot, what happens before you even think about it? You go, ow, and you move your hand away. That is always going to happen every time your nervous system detects that there is a heat source that could potentially hurt the skin. You will always have the reflex of pulling it away. Or if you think about an example of you walking around barefoot and maybe you stepped on something sharp, even before you can think about it, you'll notice that your feet will quickly elevate itself and your standing leg will go ahead and contract so that your body weight can shift without you falling over, and you're still able to lift the foot up so that you can prevent any additional injury from occurring. That is a reflex. It's an involuntary response. It will always be the same as long as the stimuli is being exposed. Now, when you look at your spinal cord, it turns out that as it travels down the back, we're going to go ahead and we're going to divide it into the cervical region, which is going to be in the neck side, the thoracic region, which of course will correspond with our thoracic cavity, so where the lungs are, lumbar, which will be the lower back, and then the sacral region. So that's where you get more down towards the hip section. And the thing is that as the spinal cord forms, we see actually that it doesn't really run the entire length of the back. Instead, what we're going to see is that we're going to reach this thing called a medullary cone, or a conus medullaris, as some of you might know it, especially those of you who are taking lab. And that's going to indicate a section where the spinal cord will come to an end and it will taper. And that's usually around the lumbar region, around L1, sometimes L2, but mostly around L1. So the spinal cord doesn't run the entire length of your back. It will taper off and end with the medullary cone around the first lumbar vertebra. But don't worry about it not running the entire length of the back, because what's going to end up happening is as the spinal cord runs from the neck through the thoracic to the lumbar section, it's going to start radiating its nerves on both sides of the body so that you're able to interpret and have afferent and efferent intersections and provide correct correspondation or communication with the rest of the nervous system. And in fact, even when it tapers out with the medullary cone, what we're going to see happening is, as it tapers out, its end will go ahead and form the cauda equina. And the cauda equina is a bundle of nerve roots that will radiate outwards from L2 all the way to the fifth sacrum vertebra. Let me go ahead and show you this on the picture, and then I can also show you the two areas where the cord is a little bit thicker, and those are going to be entitled the cervical enlargement and the lumbar enlargement. So let's go ahead, let's switch over to the next slide. All right, so here is the back, and you can see they have the spinal cord nicely drawn for you, and as you can see right here with the blue arrow, we're going to go ahead and just take a better look at it. It's kind of sorted in. You can see how the spinal cord has been drawn right here in the form of like these two columns. Notice how you have nerves that are radiating out from both sides of the spinal cord, and that of course is going to allow us to interpret and connect our sensory and motor system as we're allowed to receive the stimuli and come up with our effects. And then also what we see happening is that you right over here, you have your medullary cone. So that's around the L1 region. And that is then when the spinal cord comes to an end. And then notice how you now have a cascade of yellow nerves. Yellow is the color they're using. That's the cauda equina. And that is then going to be what we like to call our horsetail, meaning that you just have a bundle of nerves that will continue down the bottom of the back. So does the spinal cord run the entire length? No, it ends at L1, but it radiates nerves throughout the entire body so that you can have a fully functioning way of communicating with the nervous system as to what's going on. You can also notice that on the picture, they went ahead and they marked for you the cervical enlargement and the lumbar enlargement. And once again, those are the two areas where your spinal cord is slightly thicker than the rest. Now, protecting the spinal cord as well as the brain, you're going to have three membranes that, almost like a little Ziploc bag, will collect or will wrap around the tissue and protect it from the environment that it's in, and also provide a way to lubricate it due to the cerebral spinal fluid. These membranes are going to be called meninges, and you will find them both in the brain and the spinal cord. And the three that humans have are going to be the dura mater, the arachnoid matter, and the pia matter. Now, these are listed from what we call superficial to deep. Superficial means that's the top layer, and deep is going to be the deepest layer. This is the layer that directly communicates with the nervous tissue, whether it's in the brain or the spinal cord. Now, usually the dura mater and the arachnoid matter are pretty much like together, they'll adhere to each other, but then there tends to be a little bit of space between the arachnoid matter and the pia matter, and we like to call that the subarachnoid space. And this space is going to be important because it turns out that we're going to fill it with cerebral spinal fluid, and the cerebral spinal fluid will be a lubricating aspect for the central nervous system, and it will basically help keep the tissue of both the brain and the spinal cord afloat as it's being surrounded by its bony coverage. In fact, when people get an epidural, what's happening is that they go ahead and they insert the needle so that it will go ahead and release a local anesthetic within this subarachnoid space, thereby numbing the nerves that are in the specific region that need to be numbed. Let me go ahead and show you this on an illustration. Okay, so here is a cross section that we're looking at, and we can see our beautiful vertebra right over here, and then right in the opening we can see our spinal cord right over there. And then let's go ahead and find the meninges. The meninges are listed for you right over here, and what we're going to notice is that the outer sheet is the dura mater, followed very closely by the arachnoid matter here in this light blue shade. And then the pia matter, this is the most delicate meninge. It's highlighted here in like a light pink color. It will sit directly on the spinal cord as well as directly on the brain tissue. And then notice how you then have this blue cavity between the arachnoid and the pia matter. That is the subarachnoid space. Now let me just erase some of these because I've realized that I might have just kind of overwhelmed the picture. So here, this blue, light blue section indicating the liquid, that space is going to be the subarachnoid space. And once again, it's going to be filled with cerebral spinal fluid. And like I was mentioning to you before, for instance, during labor, if a woman gets an epidural, then what happens is they go with a very long needle and they go ahead and inject the anesthetic right in here in the subarachnoid space, so it can go ahead and numb the nerves and the section of the spinal cord, so that obviously labor will be a more quote-unquote pleasant experience. Alrighty. Here is another look at the meninges, and please keep in mind that these are the same meninges that you will find in the brain, and they will be in the same exact order. So the dura mater will be the tough outside one. It's really more of a connective tissue. If you have ever had the opportunity to dissect a brain, usually when it has this like white casing over it that you have to peel off. That's the dura mater that you take off. And then the arachnoid mater is the second layer, closely adheres to the dura mater. And then the innermost layer will be the pia mater. And this one will once again directly sit on the tissue itself. All right, so let's talk about a little bit of a clinical application. Now, what we're looking at here is spina bifida cystica. Here you go. And this is basically the indication that there is a cyst that is filled with cerebral spinal fluid as well as with some blood. This is due to the fact that the dura mater and the arachnoid mater will actually protrude through an opening in the vertebra. Usually it's due to the fact that the vertebra, and you can see it in the picture that's inserted right here, it's due to the fact that the vertebra does not properly encase the spinal cord as well as the meninges, so they can protrude out and they stick out underneath the skin. So you can see it here with the babies. There are different types of spina bifida. They are classified based on if it's only the meninge that protrudes out, if it's the meninge and the spinal cord. Also, it will depend on how large the cyst is formed. The good news is that this is often very treatable. It will involve a surgery on the newborn where they will then carefully go in and they will literally tuck in the meninges and the spinal cord if it's protruding. They'll drain the cyst and then properly close up the vertebra to prevent any additional protrusions from occurring. Now, let's go back to our spinal cord. Now, let's take a look at the actual look of it. So we're going to do a cross-section of the spinal cord. We now know that it's being wrapped around with the meninges, so what's actually going inside of it. And this is where we're going to go ahead and reintroduce the gray matter and the white matter. And I've mentioned these terms before, especially when we were talking about myelination in one of our previous chapters. So as you can see right here, the gray matter is going to be the area where you have a concentration of the neuron cell bodies. So this is where you're going to have the soma and the nucleus of the neurons. As you can imagine, lots of information processing. The neurons are synaptically integrating with each other. The white matter is going to get its shade because it's full of myelinated axons. So this is the part where on the side I'm going to draw for you a very simplistic neurons. Those are my little dendrites. Here's my little soma with my nucleus. And then remember the axon, only one of them. That's the one that the information is going to either do the anterograde or retrograde movement. And myelination just basically means that I take certain sections and using my different glial cells, I wrap it with a fatty layer, and that's going to help speed up the signal as it's traveling down the axon. Now, the axon, because of its myelination, will form the white matter. So if I come over here to the picture that I've inserted for you, one, I hope you'll agree with me that if I take a look at the cross-section of the spinal cord, I see that in the middle, I have a structure that has stained darker. That's very, I think it kind of looks like a butterfly. This little butterfly right here, that's going to be the gray matter. So this darker stain right here. So in this gray area, you have nothing but lots of neuron cell bodies. Now, the surrounding area, and I'm going to go ahead and change colors of my pointer so you can better see it. The surrounding area is going to have a lighter shade, and that's because that's going to correspond with the white matter. The white matter, obviously, it's because of the high amount of fat tissue that's being exposed in there, so it can't hold on to the dye as much. Hence, it's appearing more of a lighter shade. And remember, with the white matter, because this is nothing but axons, they're going to be all about carrying the signals from one part of the central nervous system to the next. We can here take another look at the cross section. So we have seen our meninges, dura mater, arachnoid, pia mater, and then now we've come to the cross section, which is this part right here. And we talked about the fact how you have your gray matter in the darkened section, and then the white matter is then the lighter area around it, divided by different columns. And then notice how from the core of the spinal cord, you now have these radiating nerves that will come out. So that's what we have to talk about next, what's happening with the nerves as they're radiating out. So these are your spinal nerves. So this is the part that will leave the vertebra and will basically wrap itself around every single part of your body so it can go ahead and connect the sensory and the motor aspect of the nervous system. Okay, So when we're looking at our spinal cord, and if we take a look at the spinal nerves, as I was pointing out in the previous section, you're going to notice that there are some that are labeled posterior and some that are labeled anterior. Now, posterior, we can also call them dorsal, because that means that that spinal nerve is going to run more towards facing your backside. Their main function is going to be carry sensory information. So the sensory information is going to come in through the dorsal or posterior root of the spinal nerve. So that's how it's going to travel its way over to the gray matter, meaning the core of the spinal cord. Then the method or the function or whatever needs to be carried out is going to be done by the anterior or ventral root. So those are going to be the spinal nerves that are facing towards your belly side, towards the front of the body. They are the ones that will go ahead and have instructions to know where their end product is going to be. So they're going to be connecting with the motor fibers. So think about, like, for instance, your neuromuscular junction. The reason the neuromuscular junction knows what to do is because an anterior root of the spinal nerve is communicating with it. Okay, so the posterior, the back ones are for sensory, and the anterior, the front ones are all about getting the course of action. So they're the ones that are communicating with the motor fibers. Obviously, there needs to be kind of like a connecting point. So what we see happening is that there's like a gray commissure. This is like where there's a little central canal where you have some epidermal cells and cerebral spinal fluid, and it will be all about connecting both the right and the left side of the spinal cord. So there can be a continuous communication between the entire gray matter aspect. Here is the same picture that we've seen before, but now I want to go ahead and take another look at the spinal nerves. And notice how the ones that are in the back, those are going to be the posterior ones. So these are your posterior roots. So these are the ones that are being able to receive sensory information, and they bring it up to the gray matter. Okay, and then within the gray matter, that is also where you're going to have the integration of the signal. They'll figure out what needs to get done, and then once you have an effect and it needs to communicate with the motor unit, we see that that message will then travel through the anterior root over to its target cell. So the anterior, that means facing towards the front. That's the ventral side, so by your belly side. And the posterior, that's more the dorsal, that's facing towards the back. So please remember that when it comes to our spinal nerve, the ones that are posterior are going to be for sensory. So they're the ones that are detecting and communicating with the gray matter. And then the anterior ones, the ones toward the front, are all about effect. So that's the one that will receive the signal as to what needs to get done, and will go ahead and connect the nerve signal with its target motor unit. The white matter, and I know this is going to be a little bit of overkill because you've seen that before, but the white matter, I should say redundancy really, the white matter really for our sakes for this chapter is just a quick reminder that's going to be nothing but bundles of axons that have been highly myelinated, and that is then why they are classified as white matter. They will provide communications at different levels of the central nervous system. Part of that is done to the fact that they will form different columns. Some will run towards the back, the posterior. You will have some to the side, which are lateral. And then, of course, the ventral will indicate towards the front by the belly side. For our sakes, for our exam purposes, I just want you to concentrate on the fact that the white matter is surrounding the gray matter when we do a cross-section of the spinal cord, and that the white matter is simply a bundle of axons. Hence, that's what it's getting its characteristics from an anatomical standpoint. Now, another thing that I want to mention is what they call spinal tracts. So this is when you start exploring how the actual spinal nerves are traveling. So where's their origin? What's the destination? What's the overall function as signals are being carried up or down? So as you start exploring different images within the book, you're going to notice that some of them are labeled as ascending tracts, which, as the name indicates, to ascend means that it tends to carry sensory information up. So these would be more for the posterior ones. Remember the ones towards the back? They're going to carry sensory information up to the nervous system. Descending tracts means that the message is traveling downwards or away. So this is going to be what we're going to do when we do our ventral or anterior movement, meaning towards the belly, and that is for us carrying motor information down. So the posterior side is more about ascending, and then the ventral anterior side is more about descending. So you can see how the sensory and the motor kind of have their individual entities as to where they are located and which way they are traveling. I also want to tell you that a lot of times when you follow the spinal tracts, you're going to see what they call the decussation. Decussation basically means that there is going to be a midline somewhere where the signal will go ahead and it will make a contralateral movement, meaning that it will move from the opposite side of the body. So for instance, to say it very plainly, if the sensory signal was detected on the right side, as the signal starts to travel up the spinal tract, we'll see that there will come a time where the signal will flip over and start traveling towards the left side of the spinal cord. And when you see it hopping from one side to the next, that is then a contralateral movement. So the origin and the destination are on the opposite sides of the body. So the right side, for instance, detects it, but the left side will analyze it. Or the left side will detect it, but the right side will analyze it. So you're switching sides. If you see that the origin and the destination are being described at the same location, the same side of the body, then it's called ipsilateral. And ipsilateral means there's no crossing over. So if the signal starts on the right side, it will be interpreted on the right side. And if the signal starts on the left side, it will be interpreted on the left side. Just a little heads up, these are really good definition type questions where I can give you a little scenario and I could say, hey, we're looking at a spinal tract. The signal is detected on the right side and it will travel up and be analyzed by the right side of the spinal cord. And if you see that everything's the same, you're going to tell me this is an example of an ipsilateral tract. On the other hand, if I say that the origin is on the left-hand side, but it was interpreted or it was destined to go to the right-hand side, we started on the left, then we went to the right. If you see that we're switching sides, then that would be contralateral. So here we go. Let's just take a look at some of our illustration. Here we have a color coding for the ascending tract. Now remember, for the ascending tract, that means that it's traveling up the spinal cord, and this will be involved with our sensory signal. So as you can see, the majority of it will fall towards the posterior columns and the posterior side of the body. The descending tract means that a signal is moving downwards. So in this case, what we're going to be looking at is more of an anterior movement. Here's just a look at, first of all, this is showing you the different layers of how a signal or a spinal tract can communicate with the brain. So you can see within slices, you can see the cerebrum, you can see the midbrain, you can see the medulla, and then of course here's your spinal cord. And what it's just showing you is just how there are different ways for the receptors to communicate for the sensory signal. So you can see right here the sensory signal is coming in through the posterior end, and it's doing an ascending motion that it starts traveling up the spinal cord and through the different layers of the brain. Notice how you have your contralateral movement happening over here. See how it flips from one side of the body to the next? And then on the right hand side, it's showing you very similar. It's showing you that the contralateral movement will actually start a little bit earlier. It will happen right here in the spinal cord, where you can see how the signal comes in. Once again, using the posterior, because posterior is for the sensory signal, and then it will go ahead and switch over to the next side of the spinal cord and then travel its way up through the different layers of the brain to be interpreted and to figure out what its effect needs to be. Let's see if we can take a look at the picture where the signal is now moving downward. So here we go. Here we have a descending pathway. And remember, with the descending pathway, that means that the interneurons have figured out what the course of action should be. So now what's going to end up happening is we're going to go ahead and travel. Let's see if we have some contralateral movement happening. Oh, yes, we do. See how it starts to flip over? And as it's flipping over, what we see happening is that not only is the signal now went from one side to the next, but we can also see that when it exits, it's going to exit through the anterior spinal cords, or spinal nerves, excuse me. And it's doing the anterior or the ventral one, because remember, those are the ones that will communicate with the motor units or your target gene that you're going to. So the posterior ones are for sensory and the anterior ones are for motor. Ascending means you're going up, descending means you're coming back down. Here is a cross-section of the nerve itself. So we've talked about how within the spinal cord, the nerves will radiate outwards. We've talked about how there's a difference between the anterior root and the posterior root. Posterior is for sensory, anterior is for motor. So now let's take a look at the actual nerve though, like what is happening over there. So as you can see, your nerves are nothing but just bundles of nerve fibers and lots of axons, and it can be a combination of myelinated and non-myelinated. Now, some of you might look at this illustration and say, you know what, it looks very similar to when we were talking about our muscles, how the muscles were just kind of like bundles of fibers and little fascicles, and you are completely correct in making that assumption. It's a very similar anatomical setup. So we see that within the nerves, we're going to have lots and lots of nerve fibers, lots of axons, and these are going to be bundled together. Now, some of these will be for sensory, so afferent, and some of them will be for motor, efferent, and a lot of times a nerve will have a combination of both. So they will have some neurons that are dedicated to sensory, some axons that are dedicated for sensory. Remember, those are on the posterior end, and then some that are dedicated for motor neurons, those are going to be on the ventral anterior end. And the nerves are extremely important because remember, that's the part that radiates out from the spinal cord. So this is what allows for the rest of the body to have its full communication aspect with the nervous system. Now, I kind of added this picture to it again. This is just a little snippet of the picture that we saw on our previous PowerPoint, because what I wanted to highlight the fact is that the nerve fibers will basically have connective tissue layers very similar to the muscles that will kind of allow the separation of an individual nerve and a bundle of nerves. So you have your endoneurium, that's going to be the internal one. This one is going to go ahead and form a loose connective tissue that's external to the neurolema, so the internal one. So here we could take a look at this one individual axon right here, and we can see our endoneurium. And these are then going to be bundled together, and then they're going to form little vasicles. And surrounding the fascicles, you're going to have the perineurium. These are more of squamous cells, so they're more like epithelium cells, and they're going to wrap themselves around the vesicle. Let me find this for you on the picture right here. Here you go. Here's the perineurium. So this will make a little bundle, and as you can see, some of them are myelinated, some of them are unmyelinated. And then all the vasicles together will kind of be bundled up to make the entire nerve. So the outer layer, the largest layer, will be the epineurium. This one is dense, irregular tissue, and as you can see, it wraps around the entire nerve. So if I come to my picture, that's going to be all the yellow right here that's encirculating the nerve. And as you can see right here, it's been labeled for you as well. I think it goes without saying that looking at the picture, you can see the blue and the red. Those are going to be our arteries and our veins that are making sure that the nerve has plenty of blood supply to be able to complete its function. So when it comes to connective tissue wrapping, endoneurium will wrap around the individual axon, perineurium will wrap around the fascicle, the bundle, and then the epineurium will wrap around the entire nerve, so all the different fascicles that are bundled together. Some of these nerves are sensory, some of them are going to be more for motor. So if you have the entity of both, then we're looking at what we call a mixed nerve. All right, so once again, the sensory nerves, those are the afferent. Those are going to be carrying signals from the sensory signal to the central nervous system. So remember, when we're doing that, then we're taking a look more on the posterior, the back part of the nerves. The motor or the efferent nerves, those are going to be carrying the signal from the central nervous system to the effector organ. So whether we're going to the muscles or the glands, these nerves are most likely communicating, I'm sorry, not most likely, these nerves initially communicate with the ventral, meaning the belly or the anterior side of the nerves, as they radiate out from the central nervous system and make their way over to whatever their target object is. And if you hear the mention of a mixed nerve, that means that that nerve will have the consistency of both sensory and motor. All right, now one other thing I want to mention is now that you know what a nerve is, which is just kind of like an extension and clusters of axons as they radiate out from the spinal cord, let's also talk about a ganglion. And the ganglion is basically going to be a cluster of what we call neurosomas that are going to occur outside of the central nervous system. So remember, your central nervous system, that is simply your brain and your spine. So anything that radiates outwards is going to be part of the peripheral nervous system. So we definitely know that the nerves that we just discussed are part of that. Sensory, motor, mixed, they all happen outside of the spinal cord and the brain, so it's part of our peripheral nervous system. But we also see that there will be thickening end parts or thickening sections on the nerves itself. Those are going to be our ganglia. And the ganglia is just a cluster of neurosomas, so the nuclei of the neurons that are happening outside of the brain and the spinal cord, so outside of the central nervous system. Probably the best example of a ganglion that you're going to need to be familiar with is going to be the posterior root ganglion. The posterior root ganglion we're going to find on the posterior end, hence on the name, and it's going to be involved with communicating sensory signal in an ascending pathway, so in an upwards track, so it can connect with the gray matter and make its way over to the brain and therefore connect to the central nervous system. Let's take a look at an illustration. So here is my cross-section of my spinal cord that I keep seeing. And then once again, I have my nerves. Remember that you have your posterior in the back. They're going to be doing the ascending because it's traveling up towards the nerves. And then the anterior here with the green arrow, that's doing its descending because that's part with the motor or the effector, the target project, so it's moving away from the central nervous system. And now what we see is if we take a look at the posterior, notice how you have a little bump, a little enlargement right here. So if we enlarge it, we see it right over here, and that's going to be our ganglion. Because it happens on the posterior, we're going to call it the posterior root ganglion. And inside of it, you can see all the neurosomas sticking out, and these are all happening outside of the central nervous system, so that's why we're going to call them a ganglion. They are just bundled together, and because they're so bundled, they allow for the enlargement to occur. So you can see the posterior root has it. It's part of the sensory pathway, but the anterior root does not have it. It just simply has the motor nerve fibers because it's part of the motor pathway as it's traveling over and connecting to whatever its effector or end motor target is going to be. Alrighty, I think I'm going to stop right here for part 1, and then in part 2 we'll take a look at some more nerves and how they radiate from the cervical all the way down to the sacral region. Alright, as always, questions, comments, concern, please feel free to email me, and we shall talk soon for part 2.